Hello and welcome to Varblog. Today I am with Dr. Robin Andersen, who is an American media scholar, author, and professor Emerita of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University. And we are looking at the military entertainment complex, as you've coined it, which I think is pretty accurate, and the current media environment. In specific, the most recent manifestation of that, which is the U.S. media coverage of Israel's genocide in Gaza, which you have now written a book about, which comes out on June 9th, which will be after I release this, but not far after I release this, called The Complicit Lens, U.S. media coverage of Israel's genocide in Gaza. And you have also done you've served on the board of directors with FAIR. Are you still on the board of directors with FAIR? I don't know.
I am.
Okay. And you've acted as a judge for Project Censored, and you've done, I'm familiar with your writings from all kinds of progressive and progressivist ish pieces like Counterpunch, Common Dreams, that sort of thing. I think it's a lot more common knowledge today than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago when I first started following this, that the coverage of events in Palestine and Gaza both have been pretty biased in the American media. I think the average person to some degree knows that more than they used to. But why do you feel that it has intensified, even if that knowledge is more understood today?
Well, maybe because the actions of the Israelis have intensified and are more extreme and blatant and just brutal and getting increasingly really straining our humanity and even our imaginations at this point. The genocide in Gaza was live streamed, and there were Palestinian journalists on the ground, and they told us the truth about what was going on. And the alternative and independent organizations that I write for, that you named, they did a terrific job. And they put it within the context. They gave us history. They interviewed analysts and aid workers and all kinds of things. And on the other hand, almost as two different realities, we have this establishment media which followed Israeli talking points, framed a genocide, calling it the Israeli-Hamas war frequently. They took it out of its historical context, and they repeated false and fabricated atrocity propaganda, and they presented a very constructive diversion from what was actually happening and still what is happening in Gaza today.
How much of this do you think is structural and inertia, and how much of it is active ideological complicity?
I think with different outlets, it's probably slightly different. I do devote an entire chapter to the New York Times and the problems with its Jerusalem bureau. The New York Times is the paper of record. It's the agenda-setting newspaper, as is CNN as a legacy media. They're both agenda setters. And the New York Times employs 7% of all the journalists in the US. I mean, they employ 30,000 journalists. So with that much staff and research assistants and just literal power, you'd think they could have done a pretty good job. But I think with the case of the New York Times, it wasn't always that way. But I think in the 21st century, everything that's happened at the New York Times, with who they chose to run their bureau in Jerusalem, what Palestinian journalists they fired when asked to by the Israeli lobby, allowing outside influence to come into their editorial rooms. The way that they hired activists and known Zionists whose children were often in the military as reporters based in Israel and as the bureau chiefs. So they have no distance from the Israeli project. And those people at the time pretty much admitted that. Jody Ridoran said that she went, one of the bureau chiefs said that she first arrived in Jerusalem with a Zionist youth group, and that's why she became interested in it. David Brooke, reporter, never a bureau chief, he had children in the Israeli military. Thomas Friedman, one of the bureau chiefs, he's the one who presided over the bureau's purchase of a house. Now the air over the house, it was on the second story of a house that had been inhabited by a Palestinian BBC sports journalist. And they had to leave during the Nakba. He and his family had to leave that house. And that's where they're located, in a house that the Israelis pushed the Palestinians out of. So that right there creates a kind of biostructural type of bias where it's completely at odds with one of the Palestinians' most important demands, and that is the right to return. So that those kinds of structural bias, and of course at CNN and New York Times, they were telling their journalists what they could and couldn't say, and at CNN they were putting it through the eyes of the IDF.
Mm. So your work has highlighted a lot of newsroom directives that have been leaked, such as the House style guides that ban the use of the words genocide, massacre, or even occupied territories, which is wild. That one surprised even me. Do you find these restrictions were driven primarily by bureaucracies and top-down management, or external political lobbying, or was it internalized professional common sense amongst journalists themselves, or all of the above? And if so, which were the primary contributors?
Well, I think it was all of the above. I think the least primary contributor was probably the journalists themselves, given that they are the ones who leaked the information to The Intercept about how the editorial board was telling them what to say. So as you pointed out, the occupied territories, refugee camps, massacre, genocide, those words you couldn't use them. So what that did to shape a pro-genocide frame was, as one journalist told The Intercept, when you take the occupation out of the equation of what's going on in the Middle East in this terrible conflict, you're taking out the core of the conflict, which is the occupation. By October 7th, we knew that the occupation had been called an apartheid, that it had been in place for years. It was illegal, and it was treating Palestinians really very badly. So right away, human rights reports had called it, had called Gaza things like an open air prison, a concentration camp, stuff like that. It was bad in Gaza. They were dependent on UNRWA for much of their food, because Israel had them under siege and had restricted literally restricted their caloric content of what they allow them, the number of calories they would allow Palestinians to eat each day. I mean, we don't understand how fast this starvation came about. It came about because of Israel's control, pretty much solid control over Gaza's economy in various ways. So outside monitoring, of course, was prevalent. There's a group called CAMRA. I already kind of mentioned, Honest Reporting was another one, the Canary Mission. These monitoring groups, they try to close down freedom of speech. They close down any criticism of Israel, any pro-Palestinian sentiments. So CAMRA, for example, is one where if an outlet didn't repeat an Israeli talking point of denial, that And they would tell the network or the newspaper, well, you didn't put in Israel's response, that where they denied that this was a massacre, for example, and things like that. So it was all of these things happening, and of course, ensconced within the military industrial complex and within foreign policy circles, and of course in the very highest levels of our democracy, with both Republican and Democratic Congress people. Huge majority of the Congress members, 82% of them, take money from AIPAC, have taken it from AIPAC in the past, up until recently. Now it's become a little bit politically toxic. But the enormous numbers of people in our ruling elite, shall we say, have taken money from the Israeli lobby. So all of those things.
On the Israeli lobby, I mean, when we talk about the Israeli lobby, we tend to think of AIPAC. I also like your mission of Cameron Canary Mission. I've been personally hit by Canary Mission, which I found hilarious. And perhaps ironically, perhaps not, my social media was hacked within 24 hours of being hit by Canary Mission. So I am unfortunately familiar with them. But I wanted to talk about like the Israeli lobby as a complex, because there's a lot of focus on AIPAC, but what other things is the Israeli state using to lobby businesses and politicians?
Well, there's all kinds of little kind of other types of PACs and dark money that are funneled into the support of Israel. A couple of analyses that I came about writing the book is that some people talk about these things, that if we really looked, we would see that these tax breaks of some of these nonprofits would actually be considered foreign influence, if it were a different country. So it's been extensive. And so over the years, it has helped to close down free speech within our civic spaces. And, this practice, we've seen it really escalate after the student encampments. But now, so many universities, not all of them by any means, but so many important universities have really brought outside monitors in to monitor the syllabus of people teaching Middle Eastern studies. That's happened at Columbia. And what the former Columbia professor who wrote the introduction to my book, Rashid Halidi, writes about is that he occupied the Edward Said chair at Columbia. So he taught Middle Eastern history, and he said he couldn't, under these conditions, teach his Middle East history class, because even just to teach the law of 2018 that further disenfranchised Palestinians would be, according to them, anti-Semitic. Just telling them the facts about how Israeli society is now structured, he would be silenced. And he said there's no way that you can actually teach this history now at that school. So he had to resign. And he wrote a couple of very good articles about that in The Guardian. But it's interesting to know that on university campuses, Canary missions, that's where they really start, and that's where they're the most effective. I'm surprised, I'm interested to know and surprised that you got attacked by Canary mission. But Canary mission attacks primarily students and faculty who they perceive as criticizing Israel, or being against the genocide, or having, the demand that Palestinians need to have a voice as well. We call that pro-Palestinian. That they then dox students who involve in those student organizations, and they call their employers, and they oftentimes get them so that they can't have jobs to get them fired from the positions that they do find themselves in. Plenty of faculty members have been the targets of canary mission and honest reporting. So it's pretty much structured within U.S. political culture. But as I say, I think that the good news is that it's been exposed post October 7th more than it ever has been in the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I'll give you a little. It was a student. It got me exposed to canary mission. So I had a graduate student in New York who's attached to the New York DSA, also of Middle Eastern background, and I was on a panel and we were talking about this, and he made a joke. Canary mission doxed him, tied me into it on social media. Like I said, within 24 hours, I got hacked. And then my face, although I was not mentioned in the article, my face was actually posted in an article in the New York Post within like 48 hours. Just for it was clearly a guilt by association tactic. I'm a high school teacher and an independent media producer. I haven't, I do work with universities locally and I teach university classes, but I'm not on faculty, so they wouldn't normally go after me. But just proximity to a student, they went after me. Also, I'm of Jewish background, and that usually gives me somewhat of a pass, and it didn't this time. They don't care anymore.
Right. So, this charge of anti-Semitism for anybody who is pro-Palestinian or against the genocide is so, particularly in New York, on the face of it, just absurd, because some of the main organizations that right after October 7th, when keep in mind that within 25 days, Israel had killed 5,000 Palestinians. That's how fast the genocide started, after all of their atrocity propaganda and all of the incitement to genocide that the Israeli military repeated over and over again and didn't get the pushback it needed to raise red flags and say, people, this sounds like genocide. What they're going to do is destroy civilian infrastructure. And that's against the Geneva Conventions. That's genocide. They're going to stop all of the aid and all of the food. They're going to do these things that are simply disproportionate violence and collective punishment. Collective punishment being you attack the civilians for the actions of your fighters or your leaders, right? So all of that was happening right away, and 5,000 Palestinians were killed. This stuff happened almost immediately, but it was Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, who the young woman was featured on the film. The Israelism, which was just getting some traction before October 7th, was a fantastic illustration of what was going on in Israel in terms of the attacks on the West Bank and settler violence and stuff like that, and how the Israeli military viewed Palestinians as just terrorists and Arabs, right, and had to complete and utter disdain for them. It was those organizations at the front of the organizing to do things like close down the Manhattan Bridge, go out to the Statue of Liberty, occupy Grand Central Station with black T-shirts with white letters that said "Not in my name," Jews against genocide. So the idea that this movement is anti-Semitic is, on the face of it, a fiction.
Yeah, that change of the definition of anti-Semitism has been profound, and I've seen it. I live and work through most of my life in the United States and red states. I'm in Utah. I was born in Georgia, grew up there, and I've seen all of a sudden like this explosion of anti-Semitic propaganda. And while I do think there has been a real increase in actual anti-Semitism, although I think Israel's a good contributor as to why.
Absolutely.
Most of this seems like it's actually just propaganda for the Israeli state and doesn't really have anything to do with like the Jewish diaspora who is not Zionist, which is what, you know, amongst younger Jews is like 40 to 45% of the Jewish population in the United States. Amongst older Jews, it's not. It's still, they're still pretty Zionist, but it's really worrying as a framing, because once you invoke anti-Semitism, you also start building a legal framework to get around normal protections of speech. Right. And that is really worrying to me, as we've seen this on platforms like particularly TikTok, which I somewhat hyperbolically but just barely now refer to as a US-Israeli joint spying app. Right. But it is interesting, because one of the problems that you have for the Israelis on things like TikTok and Instagram, particularly on TikTok, they were posting the unedited footage. It wasn't just, you know, it wasn't just like citizen journalists or Palestinians or Palestinian advocates. It was coming from like IDF accounts too. And I felt like they were literally trying to gaslight me, because they were putting the stuff out that condemned them and also calling us, you know, anti-Semitic or crazy, when we were like, but you showed us, you literally just showed us that, like, you posted it, not like
you're denying it, and you're showing it to us at the same time, and you're denying it at the same time. I know, it's crazy. Well, you know, Richard Sanders, the British film director, who had two, probably more now, but I do reference two of his films in the book, War Crimes in Gaza, where he simply puts up the posts that Israeli soldiers did themselves committing war crimes. You know, you can't go in and destroy people's property if they're not there, when they're not there under conditions of conflict. They were putting on women's underwear in the most, well, there's really just something wrong with these people. I'm sorry. It's just the kind of brutality and the depravity of these soldiers. And oftentimes they were posting them on their dating sites, right, to make people like them. And just today, I saw another one of those Pollywood videos where Israelis would dress up as if they were Palestinians in refugee camps. They'd black out their tooth. They'd have a scarf on. They'd put some red on their face to make blood, and then they would mock injured Palestinians. And it was in regard to one of those people who had engaged in that. Just had her house as a settler on the West Bank just was struck by a bomb, and she was crying, and she was, you know, very upset about being hit and her house being destroyed. And I guess that, you know, that was their initial response when the very thing that finally happened to her had happened to the Palestinians. And there's many examples of the awful ways in which they mock. Now even they mock rape of what's happening to Palestinians, which, you know, Euromed Monitor for Human Rights has called, you know, the worst kind of torture. It destroys individual, and it destroys identities, and all of these things are happening in the most brutal ways. But you're right, they were posting some of that stuff, and so when they admit it and show themselves to who they are, now Netanyahu is always talking about, well, greater Israel, and we're going to take over in the entire south of Lebanon. I mean, the media is now doing the same thing that they did in Gaza. So they've just substituted Hezbollah or Gaza for Hezbollah, and they're never really killing civilians with 2,000-pound anti-civilian bombs to take out entire families and entire buildings. they're just targeting Hamas, just like now they're targeting Hezbollah while they're taking out Palestinian villages. This is not a conflict where it's Israel against Hezbollah or Israel against Hamas. This is Israeli genocide happening now in another country under their expansion model of the greater Israel. And mainstream and media simply will not say that. They call it a buffer zone. They call it forced evacuation instead of ethnic cleansing, and they'll come up with any way they can get around telling the truth. And you and I know the truth, and most of the global public now know the truth. And we know this because Israel's poll numbers are so disfavorable at this point. So the whole world knows. But so it tells you who these establishment media are, who their audiences are. It's the military industrial complex. It's the owners of their media. It's the extractive industries. It's anybody who benefits from a status quo defined by extreme inequality and oppression. That's who this media frame is for.
Yeah, I think that's become increasingly clear. I mean, I've known about Ersatz Israel for a long time because I read basic Hebrew, and I lived in Egypt for a while. And I also know that like that patch that's on some of the IDF shoulders, it has Egypt and Syria and all of Palestine and most of Lebanon and parts of Jordan all claimed as part of this Ersatz Israeli state, which also never historically existed. It's wild to me that it's just ignored. You did see, there's some interesting and not unproblematic awakening to this on the right too. Unfortunately, it does have a real anti-Semitic vector there.
Yeah,
but a lot of it is, that aside, I think a lot of it's sincere, coming from people like Tucker Carlson. But it's interesting how it manifests. So like they start to care when they realize, oh, there are Christians in Lebanon and Christian icons and Christian churches are being destroyed. And I'm like, well, there are Christians in Palestine, my friend. Like,
right. An incredible time where they attacked those women going across the courtyard of a church, of a Christian church. They just killed them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it is kind of it's both hopeful in that I now see that this is now an issue on the right, but worrying at how limited it is, because I'm like, okay, so they broke a Jesus statue and you're mad about that. They've been killing Christians for a long time because there's Christians throughout the Middle East. I don't know what you're talking about and how you didn't know that. And honestly, I'm more worried that they're killing people than just killing Christians. So yeah, I have been thinking a lot about this though, and the way this gets framed. One of the things that you pay a lot of attention to in your reporting, and it's not just in this book, it's something that you've focused on through most of your career, from what I can tell from the other books of yours I've seen, is the way, let's just call it, weaponized passive voice is used selectively. So you have obfuscations of violence, like you'll have something called an explosion or an aid related death when it's clearly they shot aid workers, or they bombed a village. How do these grammatical and stylistic choices function over time and place to shape public consciousness? And do you think they're working anymore? Because I'm not sure they are.
I think they're working much less. But if you think about the rapidness with which Israel started bombing and really, doing mass murder in Gaza, almost immediately, we see that those were very effective. So when they bombed the Jabalia refugee camp, it was just an explosion. Now, they also said neighborhood, that Jabalia was a neighborhood. And that was one of the words that the directives at the New York Times wanted them to use. Don't use refugee camp. We were talking about history a little while ago. Well, the people in Gaza, and particularly in the Jabalia refugee camp, were direct descendants, over generations of those who were forced out of Jerusalem, other parts of Palestine and forced into Gaza during the Nakba. So, anyway, the numbers are insane. But so they couldn't say refugee camps. So there was an explosion in the Jabalian neighborhood, and then they pointed to, like, this is the New York Times, right? They don't have access to any other coverage. They select a single picture of sheets. Obviously, they're dead bodies, and they have sheets over them. And the Red Cross had placed some of the dead civilians in a row, and they said, "Oh, look, there's these things appear to be bodies." Right? What else could they possibly be? So that was the first real massacre. That was several 2,000-pound bombs hit that densely populated refugee camp in northern Gaza on October 31st. And right then, Common Dreams and other people on the ground were saying, this is genocide. You can't do this. This is against international law. So that was, extreme cognitive dissonance between looking at online reporting and our independent and alternative international organizations, and then to look at the New York Times and their obfuscating language. A little bit later, by the spring of 2024, when they called it aid-related deaths, it's like they had successfully already made Palestinians very hungry. They were starving then. Spring of 2024, that's only 6-7 months after October 7th. So it shows you how rapidly this worked, and the media was still obfuscating like crazy. They made it sound like the aid trucks just had some, bad luck, or that these were Israeli soldiers on top of aid trucks shooting at hungry Palestinians as they approached trucks carrying flour, which they really needed. So they never said that, but online there was a lot of very good media criticism, citations needed, other people in independent outlets, and they started pointing this out, and they said Israel simply can't put a simple sentence together when it involves Israeli war crimes. Israel shot and killed hungry Palestinians. They are starving to death as the genocide continues. That's the way it should have been reported. Shortly after that, Gutierrez called it a graveyard for children. And that was the UN director calling it a graveyard for children. Indeed, it was. But why did the media pick up on that one phrase, a graveyard for children? Because it doesn't tell you who put those children in those graves. It doesn't tell you anything. It's just, it's a mysterious, it's just a humanitarian, terrible emergency that we don't know how it happened. And it's become a graveyard for children. And when you present that type of horrible suffering in that language, it's a big emotional blow to us, to the people who see it, to the viewers. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know where the suffering has come from. We don't know how we can stop it. We don't know what we can do, because they're never going to say, Israel needs to do this, Israel needs to stop, any of those things. So it's a kind of lack of any kind of journalistic standards of who, what, where, why, and when, or fairness, or balance, or accuracy. All of that stuff was completely abandoned in mainstream media with this genocide.
One of the things that I noticed, and you have written about, but I noticed it too, was the games of the first 2 years of the conflict, and I'm putting that in quotations, for those of you who are just listening, was the use of death toll figures that had to be wrong. Even during the Biden administration, you were getting the death toll numbers, and they mysteriously kind of froze 4 months in. So once you hit like 40,000, they were just like, we're not going to report it anymore. Or I would get that number for like a year later, and I'm like, there's no way that's remotely true, because this conflict's been going on for a year and it's actually intensified. And even if I bought your framing, there's no way that can be true. But the other thing I would see is, even on the 40,000, they would say things like, Hamas-run Ministry of Health, ignoring that like there has not legally been allowed to be elections in Gaza since 2007. So I literally told someone, they're like, "Oh, they voted for Hamas," and I'm like, I'm going to bracket out the morality or lack of morality of Hamas. We're just going to take that out of the equation right now. Most of the people in Gaza were not even alive the last time there was an election. Like 50% of the population is under 18. It's been over 18 years since an election. I don't know how this theory of democratic accountability, which would still not pass muster under international law, even holds when there's been no elections and since in over 20 years, and you have a population that is majority under 18. How on earth does this work? But even beyond that, it was pretty clear that this was just like a sowing the seeds of doubt mechanism that I had seen priorly on Israel. Like, I'd seen this done and reporting about Gaza, our reporting about the PLO before Hamas and all this, going all the way back to the 1980s. But like, it seemed particularly galling to do that because, one, I don't think they were telling us the truth about the numbers anyway, and two, when they were doing this little, we weren't saying like according to the Likud run
Israeli government, right?
Right. It just seems so clearly to be lying by omission and hoping that prior associations of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood could do a lot of work for you to cast doubt on those numbers. I find it interesting because I don't think the quote unquote mainstream, I don't know that they're mainstream anymore. Let's just call them legacy media. That's probably more accurate anyway. Legacy media was really doing much to even kind of be fair here.
No, they weren't. And they were closing out Palestinian voices regularly. But yeah, really good point that they were engaging all of those falsities and twisted and misdirected understanding of the history of the conflict to work their persuasion for them. So if you're talking about civilian support of a government, so therefore they are part of who can be attacked, that is absolutely against any way of humanitarian thinking, any way against the laws or rules of war. And those laws and rules of war were designed exactly to prevent those kinds of arguments being made. Also, when you had Gallant and Elan saying things like, Hamas attacked Israel, and instead of being appalled, people in Gaza are celebrating. They want hell, we'll give them hell. We're going to stop all their food. We're going to stop all their aid. We're going to turn them into a tent city. So what they did is they took Hamas and they simply associated the entire civilian population in Gaza, tied it with that rhetoric. And that is incitement to genocide. So right there, at a moment of very high tension, you call for the destruction of civilians and civilian infrastructure over mainstream media outlets, as a time, and you are in a position of power and authority. That is against the Genocide Convention. That's incitement to genocide. Now, how do we say that the U.S. media didn't push back on that? Allowed them to get away with incitement, allow them to use their news frames and stories to get away with genocide. Right? It was also part of the demonization and dehumanization first of the Palestinians, and then the demonization. And what I found in the coverage was that you couldn't say massacre for Palestinians, but you could certainly say massacre for Israelis killed by Hamas. So after, and this was done in newspapers from about 6 weeks from middle October to middle of November. So well after 5,000-6,000 Palestinians had been killed. They were using massacre for Israelis, which with the ratio by then was like 1 to 33 or something, and only for one Palestinian did they say massacre. So 53 times the New York Times said massacre for Israelis and one time for a Palestinian. And then, as you point out, with the body counts, they were associated with the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. When the UN and Human Rights Watch and all of the agencies, global aid, had relied on their numbers were accurate. People were saying that these numbers are always accurate. So stop questioning them. Also, the underestimation. Today we still those body counts, those are literally people that they know have been killed. How many people are still under the rubble? How many people have just been buried under the rubble? And also, in this kind of a genocide and this kind of ongoing attacks where you've destroyed hospitals, you've destroyed shelters, you've destroyed schools, you've destroyed aid of any kind, you're starving these people. Just imagine at this point right now, how many people are dying each day, even if they haven't been targeted, which they have been, even those should be in that body count who haven't been targeted by the Israelis, right? Even during their supposed ceasefire, which was just we fire and you cease firing, and then we'll call that a ceasefire. So none of that has been true. It's like endless lie upon lie. But when I wrote the book by end of 2024, I think the Lancet had used the statistical methodology used by those who count these figures of violent deaths as a consequence, not that this one account of this one individual has died, but how many people must be dead under these conditions, out of this kind of barrage of attacks of all sorts. And it was that 187. Francesca Albanese has now come up with a story that with a number that it has to be at least 650,000, and that to me seems more like it. When you think of how many, there was 2.2, 2.3 million Palestinians in this tiny little piece of Gaza. And now they are occupying, they're in less than 50% of it, and it's going down and down. They've got no aid, they've got no food, they've just turned off the electricity. These people are dying. They're dying as we speak. And that's the horrible thing about it. And these people haven't come to account. They haven't come to account for killing journalists, for killing and torturing doctors, for destroying an entire healthcare system. They've gotten away with it. And that's why they've normalized it, because of the way the media covered the war. And that's why I've said that they're complicit in a genocide. And someday the Israelis will be held accountable. They will certainly be someday.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that could get very ugly. But at a certain point, I have to just go like, well, you can't do this forever without people realizing it. But yeah. I have also figured it had to be, my estimates from what I've read, extrapolating from the Lancet, was like, it's got to be like a fourth of the population gone. Because I don't think people understand how small Gaza is and how densely packed it is and how young it was. I have the unfortunate I have been to Gaza, so like I already knew that, but trying to explain that to Americans for years was very, very hard to do. Because I'm like, no, it's basically, it's not just an open air prison. It's like an open air prison that's super overcrowded and has very little infrastructure, and it's been that way, I don't know, for a decade and a half before this started. And it was already quite desperate. And I don't think people quite understood that until relatively recently. And yeah, I mean, when you're talking about, you look at, I was looking at aerial photography of Gaza, and just looking at the amount of it that is uninhabitable now, I'm like, there's no way that you haven't lost at least a fourth of the population, which is huge, and it's the kind of level of massacre we really haven't seen since, I don't know, the Nazi occupation of Belarusia, that kind of thing. These are early 20th century mass war crimes. You make a point about the indirect deaths, and it's also clear that even that number from the Ministry of Health was only on direct deaths. Do we think that this is going to get worse? Because, I mean, one thing that I have found, unfortunately, is as things go on and as the conflicts in the Middle East start popping up in other places, you have the Iran war, you have this invasion of southern Lebanon. I've been telling people Egypt's gearing up to be invaded. Do you think this is going to be that people are going to get fatigued and quit following what's going on? That's one of my concerns.
I think people do have fatigue, but what the establishment media has done is simply it's fallen out of the frame. Palestinians have fallen out of the frame, and as I mentioned before, they're calling Lebanon now buffer zones and all these other euphemisms that you really pointed out well. I think I think as Israel becomes more brutal and more empowered because of its lack of accountability, the treatment of the flotilla members was a huge indication of that. Now the world is beginning to understand that these people have really gone too far. When they saw Ben-Gvir putting Europeans in stress positions, and then the incredible testimonies that the people gave about how they were treated in these containers, and they were beaten. So many of them have broken arms, broken collarbones, and they were raped and sexually assaulted. I think it has to be giving people pause. I mean, a lot of people said they were only concerned about them because they were European. And certainly we got a taste of what the Palestinians, because we looked through the eyes of Europeans. But I think it wasn't lost on people that this kind of treatment has been happening to Palestinians, particularly in detention, particularly now that finally the New York Times told the truth, allowed their premier social human rights reporter Nicholas Kristof to publish an op-ed piece that details how Israeli was raping Palestinian prisoners with dogs and stuff like that, and these Europeans were subjected to that, and many of them, over 400, and many of the European countries. What has to happen is that European countries need to stop agreeing and blocking UN resolutions against Israel. They need to stop engaging with them. They need to stop supporting them with military, and they need to also just keep them out of their airspace, and trade with them. That's how this thing is going to stop. And I think that was a big step forward in at least trying to stop that, where you did get European governments, even if it was just bad PR they were concerned with. It's unbelievable now, even though we're not getting, it's still on the table. Gaza is still being talked about, even though we're not getting any actual news from it. Now that they've really killed over 300, they've probably killed at least 300 journalists in Gaza with censorship by murder. targeting them. And if you think about the Israelis' excuse all the time that this was all just retaliation for Hamas, that this was all just trying to get Hamas, if you see how they target people, they can target them, right? You don't need to take out 2 apartment buildings and entire lineages of family to try to get one Hamas fighter, which is what they sold to the US media and they tried to sell to the US public, but we didn't buy it. We just didn't buy it, even though the New York Times did and most of our establishment media did. But this kind of violence is I think going to have to come to its end pretty soon. And if we get back to our topic about anti-Semitism, they actually relied on anti-Semitism to point the finger at Ben-Gvir, who's an individual, obviously stereotypic type of, in that video, representation of a Jew. And then they wanted to blame him singly, not the genocide, not the military, but him singly, as that's the only thing we have to worry about, is this one guy who's giving us some really bad press because he fits the stereotypes.
Well, this does actually bring me to something that I've had problems with, even with progressive media, is trying to explain that, like, okay, yes, Likud, Netanyahu, his right-wing coalition are particularly bad, but the center parties in Israel, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, are not a whole lot better. And the left parties are mostly gone. There's been some amount of repatriation to Europe and America. It's just trying to get this out has been difficult. And I'll tell you, one of the other frustrating things, as a person who actually can read original reporting in Hebrew and has a basic, very, very rudimentary understanding of Arabic. Arabic's actually really hard for me, but I did live in Egypt for 2 years. Even if I was to directly translate Israeli newspapers into English, I would probably get called anti-Semitic, because some stuff that gets said in Hebrew is not sugar-coated for domestic consumption the way the stuff in English is sugar-coated for international consumption. Right. And the anger, I mean, I've been kind of amazed at the anger the Israeli media has at the United States for not being complicit enough. And that's something I've been trying to like, no, if it's bad as it is, they actually are mad that we're not even more towing their line in Israeli reports. And you hardly ever see this talked about in American media at all. I wanted to ask you, though, maybe in lieu of that, I have seen a crackdown on social media about this. It's like shadow banning is becoming more common. Banning for being called anti-Semitic. As I mentioned, I got caught in a troll by Canary Mission. This is becoming a bigger battleground. When Larry Ellison got control of TikTok, a lot of the rules changed, and it looked like for 24 hours they weren't allowing any posting politically at all. Do you think they will be successful in trying to censor social media in the same way they've gotten control of this legacy media? Because the one issue with social media is it's much, much more difficult and much more intrusive to stop voices talking about things. Particularly if you are relying on an algorithm that is easily tricked by just changing a word. But
right. Well, Alan McLeod has done, I think, some of the best reporting on big tech and how they have Facebook has hired people from, ex-CIA agents, ex-FBI agents. They've pulled lots and lots of Palestinian sites off of Facebook and off social media sites. So I think they really are trying to control it. And I think it's going to be our job to really fight this and find ways around it. But that's the next big thing, I think is billionaire capture that we're seeing with CBS and the Ellisons, with the merger between and creating this company of media moguls. It's so weird. Ironically, the New York Times wrote a piece about Scott Pelley's been all over the media because he finally told the truth about what was happening with 60 Minutes and with Barry Weiss, now head of CBS News, put in place by the Ellisons, who are very tied to Israel. Barry Weiss, a self-proclaimed fanatical Zionist who has never done anything with television. She's never even written or directed a news story. She knew nothing about this, and all she did was come in and tell people like Scott Pelley, who's worked at CBS and 60 Minutes for over 30 years, try to make those anti-Trump demonstrators look more violent, she told him. That was reported recently. And that was reported in the New York Times against their competition, CBS News. Isn't it interesting, however, that the New York Times allowed themselves to be directed by Israel to say, don't say that we dropped that bomb. Say that, and don't tell anybody we dropped that bomb until we identify a Hamas fighter that we say we killed there. So, don't use emotive words for Palestinians. Use body counts that are abstracted and dehumanized. And then if let's leave Palestinian voices off of these news sites. So whenever there was a table around the table, and all the monitoring that we talked about before. So we really have. So I'm making several points here. We really do have to watch AI uses now of the way the Israelis are going to be designing new Hasbara techniques. And how they're going to be really engaging in social media now with big tech and with all the tools of AI and deep fakes and things like that. It's become very difficult online now to see. There's a lot of fake footage that shows various countries being blown up. And when they're honest, they say, this is just my AI fantasy. I'd like to see this. I was watching one where Ben-Gvir, where some guy intervenes when Gvir, where a guy's on his knees begging Ben-Gvir. Some guy comes out, slaps Ben-Gvir and pushes him away and says, now, didn't you like that? But that's AI, but I'm going to still watch it, right? The danger there is it's a faux, surreal kind of revenge or accountability that is not, it simply isn't real, and it's not how to do it. And it also it can't be done at an individual level like that. It has to be systematic. It has to be challenged by constituents and all kinds of different campaigns and keep getting in the streets, and all of that way we can participate in the way in making our government do what we want to do. But just circling back to the New York Times and it's exposing CBS, they don't expose themselves, and they never have. For the rape story that was, complete fabrications based on known fabricators, not one legitimate eyewitness testimony, no forensic evidence, no visual evidence whatsoever. To not have rolled back that story, it's done an investigation about how it happened, told their readers what they did, which journalism professors enjoined them to do, but they didn't. This is a huge black mark on the New York Times. And in fact, if you put that story in, they will redirect you to a redone story in March of 2024. The original piece was published on December 28th and online, and then in the paper on the 30th or 31st. So exact end of 2023. I can't find that story. I looked for it the other day on the original link that I had for it, and I was directed to a story that was redone in March. However, no acknowledgement and no accountability. for this kind of horrible misinformation. So this information abundance that we have that we need to pick and choose from, and it's getting harder and harder to tell what is real and what is true. And the papers of record in this country, we can no longer rely on legacy media. So it's a very difficult terrain to navigate, I think, for us at this point, and for all the reasons that you've brought up.
Yeah, I did not know about the AI revenge on Ben Gvir. I'm sure it is satisfying to watch that guy get slapped around. But I was thinking about this because this also happened in Minneapolis, where there was a faux video that was AI generated about a priest dressing down an ICE officer that was completely not real.
Yes.
And I'm like, well, that feels good, and I'm sure there's plenty of priests out there who want to do it, but it didn't happen.
Right.
And I worry about this greatly. A media environment that becomes increasingly low trust. Having lived in Egypt, which is a very low trust environment, where no one trusts the media, but unfortunately what propagates is all kinds of conspiracies, some of which are plausible, maybe even be true, and some of which are absolutely batshit insane. But it makes up for the fact that there is no civic institution that has enough trust, for legitimate reasons, frankly, to offer any kind of counter narrative. And I increasingly see that here, and that also concerns me because how do I argue with someone who just says, nah, all that stuff in Gaza just didn't happen at all? Like, it's all a conspiracy.
Right.
I'm like, okay, I got nothing.
Right. It's very difficult. What can you say?
Right.
And I saw a couple pieces, and now the bots, or the whoever these people are that are representing themselves online as real people, they'll just go ha 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 ha, or they've actually got nothing but to just deny, or to mock, or to call names. So for a genocide that's been the most well-documented, live-streamed genocide in the history of this kind of horrible mass murder, and to be the most contested, really does present a problem for media critics such as ourselves, and myself, and analysts. And it's a terrain where, we've got some issues here, don't we?
Yeah. Well, I guess this is my last question. I do want to push a little bit more on this way in which these media operations kind of partially betray themselves. For example, there's been a whole lot of reporting about how bad of a job Bayer Rice is doing at CBS, and how explicitly, painfully right-wing and Zionist she is. And I don't know, anyone who would read the Free Press would have known that was going to happen. But that it's actually damaging CBS's brand significantly. Do we see that happening across the board? There's been people angry at the New York Times for as long as I've been alive, but it's mostly been right-wingers. I have finally seen a lot of progressives wake up about how problematic the Times really is. But do we see that kind of accountability for these other legacy institutions? Because the anger about this is pretty high, and it's not even like I've been talking to you about. It's not even ideologically limited to just progressives or far leftists anymore. It's across the board. I think one of the most interesting things as far as following the right is the hyper apologism of some of the right, which I think is still a small majority, but then real anger on the other part of the right about this. And some people sounding like me. It's I'm like, when I'm always weirded out when I'm like, Tucker Carlson sounds like me all of a sudden. I don't know how I feel about that.
I know it is weird. It's scary.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good, but I'm not sure. So
Well, in terms of electoral politics, right? Independents have, there's always been a core of 30-35% people who are going to vote for a white supremacist. That's the nature that Steve Phillips, the elections in color, the guy who really knows how to poll black people, and he really has a handle on these demographics. And what he says is there's 30-35%.
mm-hmm.
Independents, Trump ran and they bought it, right? He ran as a peace president. He was not going to have any more wars, no more wars for Trump. And that whole sector now is gone. That's finished. It was very, very difficult for people to vote for someone who is actively supporting a genocide and lying about it the whole time, President, Joe Biden, and that Kamala Harris, we don't have time to get into it right anymore, but Kamala Harris, lost it because she lost the swing states, and she wouldn't, and she took the Palestinian narrative out of the Democratic National Convention. Anyway,
which cost her Michigan. I mean, I can't say it cost the other swing states, but it has been objectively proven to be a key factor in Michigan.
Well, polls show too that a lot of people who didn't come out, which was why they lost. 9 million people didn't come out, and Gaza was high on the list. Usually, foreign policy doesn't factor in that much. It's usually always bread and butter issues and economic and social. And we've learned all this stupid cultural stuff, but it was many people subsequent to the election talked about Gaza as one of the primary reasons. And that certainly isn't in the autopsy, is it? In fact, Gaza wasn't even mentioned in the Democratic autopsy, so to speak. But in terms of social media and where we're going to go from here, I don't think there's going to be a real change in big tech and in even our media landscape because of the ownership structures and the role that Trump's FCC is now playing, Federal Communication Commission. What we need is to start pulling these conglomerates apart. So when the Ellisons merged, and then now they're going to merge again and they're going to make there's going to be this huge media mogul that are basically pro-Israel and Zionist. That is an unusual thing, and we need to start regulating this kind of ownership. In terms of the ownership, there's always been a problem with centralization and who's on the boards of directors of these interlocking directorates that own media outlets and organizations and institutions, and also have the same stock in and the same skin in the military industrial complex and the extractive industry. So those people are many of the same people on the boards of these directors. So that's what centralization and conglomeration has done. But for a legacy media like CBS, CBS has a brand. CBS is the network of Edward R. Murrow. It is the legacy of legacy media. It invented television news, and it invented the broadcast documentary with Edward R. Murrow. And CBS was the last vestige. 60 Minutes was the last vestige of that. And for a head of CBS News to be a self-identified fanatical Zionist who's now being reported that she told the likes of Scott Pelley to make the footage look as if Renee Good, who was killed by ICE in Minneapolis in the winter of 2026, to make it look as if she was running straight into the ICE agent who killed her, which is a blatant lie. That's not going to go down well with the American public. The American people believe that they still live in a democracy where they don't have propaganda in the face all the time. And if they stop believing that, and CBS doesn't want CBS certainly doesn't want another Fox News, right? CBS is not Fox News. So Fox News is, the viewers of Fox News are sitting in front of CBS, and they don't want to see Fox News. They want to see at least an outlet that looks like it is balanced, that looks like it has some fairness, that looks like it's accurate and telling, and has the same cutting edge kind of journalistic investigative attitude that 60 Minutes has always presented. And so these are just some of the things that come into play. But 60 Minutes was destined to lose its audience the minute they put her in charge of that network without any experience and with a complete ideological point of view that she was very vested in promoting. And that's clearly not working. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, the legacy media is not a Substack. And she clearly treats it like one, and in a way that's also very hard even for her own brand. I'm just a interested anti-woke libertarian. It's hard to justify when you're like, let's make the police look, the ICE look like extrajudicial killing that no one's even arguing isn't a crime. They just aren't allowing it to be properly investigated. I was trying to make that look good. I mean, it's wild because, I expect that from internet chuds, but I don't expect it from not even a conservative news agency. I mean, if anything, I would expect them to just be quiet about it and shut up, like Fox normally does when this stuff happens.
Right.
Right.
Emphasize, the odd story that proves their point, and
right. Yeah.
Not manufacture video. We're learning a little bit from the Israelis because that's what they do all the time. They've done it for years. Pseudo evidence, and journalists kept buying pseudo evidence, even though they knew over and over again that it had been fabricated.
Yeah. People should read your book because you go into this in a lot more detail. Where can people find your work? As I kind of mentioned in the beginning, it's kind of all over the place, but in addition to your book.
Right. Well, you can buy the book from the publisher, orbooks.com, and just put in, so it's OR, it's like OR books. So orbooks.com, and put in the Complicit Lens or my name and it'll come right up. It's going to be in bookstores, and they've got a pretty wide distribution in bookstores. You can call them up and ask them if they've got it. That'd be good. Maybe they'll try to get it. But I can be found on, oh gosh, you mentioned Counterpunch and Common Dreams. I've also been on LA Progressive, the Progressive magazine. And I write for Fair, and I'm around. They'll see it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right.